Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Fedeli from Rosie the Riveter Trust. I'm a member of the board and really glad to be here with you this evening. Very excited to welcome our family friend Malik Ali to speak to you tonight. This is a really great connection because we've just started this Rosie Presents program this year and looking forward to bringing you speakers each month on different public policy and communications issues related to World War II and women in the workforce and all of the Rosie issues. Tonight, we're going to hear about Executive Order 8802, which Malik has written on last year, the 80th anniversary of this executive order from FDR, and looking forward to getting into the details of that. Malik is a Harvard graduate and a distinguished scholar. He's a teacher, at the Branson School in Marin and has taught at many different levels and written extensively. And without further ado, Malik, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it. Glad to be with you and glad to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about Executive Order 8802. Can I take it away and present? Is that good? Will do. Okay. So just going to take a little bit of time to kind of talk through some of the ins and outs of 8802. So give me a second to share. Okay. So here we are tonight talking about Executive Order 8802 in context. Here's the Rosie Trust, here's FDR, here's me, let's go. So taking time to look at Executive Order 8802 in context, I want to think about it and discuss it kind of in three acts, right? First, I'll talk about the kind of textbook story, the FDR perspective, the presidential action. Then I'll shift to talking about the civil rights context. And then I'll try to close out with thinking about some of the important lessons and takeaways that I think are important to bear in mind. So when we zoom in on FDR's thinking, I like to think of it as a story in three documents. There are different strands from each of these three documents that kind of feed into the next one and lead up to accumulate in what we ultimately get in Executive Order 8802. So we see a kind of cumulative thought process that builds toward the Fair Employment Order. And so I'll try to identify and highlight key strands here in each one. So the first one is the Arsenal of Democracy. That's his fireside chat at the end of 1940. Then about a week later, there's the Four Freedoms speech, the famous speech that is the State of the Union address for that year in January of 1941. And then at the end of June, the Executive Order 8802. Okay, so the Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat, right? The fireside chats were these radio addresses that FDR gave where he had the opportunity to kind of talk in a familiar way to the American public about policy issues. And so in the Arsenal of Democracy chat, FDR insists that supporting Great Britain's resistance to the Nazi aggression was essential to national security. But he also wants to reassure Americans that the United States is not entering the war militarily. So they're stopping short of war, he says. So it's a material support, not a military support. And one of the kind of lines that captures that is the idea that our national policy is not directed toward war. Its sole purpose is to keep war away from our country and our people. And particularly relevant to 8802, he has this line later where he says, evil forces of the Axis powers would try to reawaken long slumbering racial and religious enmities, which should have no place in our country. And I would just note that that understanding that racial and religious enmities were long slumbering is a fairly privileged perspective of the time, because that certainly was not the perspective of a lot of marginalized Americans. But interestingly enough, it does track with what we know of survey and polling data for a lot of particularly white Americans who did not recognize or said they were not aware of the kind of festering racial and religious issues in society. So it mirrors that, but it's also a privileged perspective, and that's important to note. Perhaps more significantly, at the turn of the year, just about a week later, he goes from the arsenal of democracy to the four freedoms. And the four freedoms is the State of the Union address, right? That's the constitutionally required message to Congress that the president must give every year. But now we're in a point in time where states of the Union addresses have been, by 41, have been radio broadcast for almost a decade and a half, basically. So they're not just addresses to Congress, right? They're addresses to the public in front of Congress, right? Because they're like another arm of the fireside chats in a way. So the audience is Congress, but the audience is also the public. And in the course of this, as I know in his first bullet point, this is where he makes the public request of Congress for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies. This is formalizing things that are already in place up to this point. The United States government's support of the war effort, the building of an arsenal of democracy, this formalizes it in this moment. But then also, this framing of the conflict is really important that comes through in the four freedoms. This is where Roosevelt starts to talk about the democratic way of life, democratic existence. He's making clear that democracy is not just a political condition, but it's also a social condition, right? That they have to defend the social conditions that make freedom possible, right? And so he presents these four freedoms as kind of exemplary of the democratic way of life. It's not just, can you vote? Do you vote? Although those things are vitally important. It's also about access and empowerment in the kind of shared public sphere. And so he sees those represented by these four freedoms. The image that I have here on the right is from the FDR Digital Library, and this is of the 5th draft with some of Roosevelt's handwritten additions and corrections. And so on this next slide, I've broken those out. These are Roosevelt's words that I've placed here side by side with the famous paintings from Norman Rockwell that were published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1943. The freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from fear, the freedom from want. And I just read those. I don't know that I read those clockwise, right? And so Roosevelt defines freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. And I'll keep going clockwise. Freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. Those would have been fairly familiar. Those are parts of the First Amendment. And then continuing to go clockwise, freedom from fear, which means a worldwide reduction of armaments to prevent acts of aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. And then freedom from want, which means economic understandings which secure a healthy peacetime life everywhere in the world. And I read those clockwise for a reason, because I do want to focus in on freedom from want momentarily. So if you look at Roosevelt's description of freedom of speech and freedom of worship, and you look at Rockwell's paintings, those map on pretty closely. You look at freedom from fear, those map on not as directly, but still fairly closely, right? You have a family there tucking children in, the parents are tucking the children in, the father's holding onto a newspaper, but still wants the children to be secure from those concerns in the world. But the freedom from want one, that one is interesting, because that one, you see a little bit of a disconnect from the way Roosevelt initially articulates it, and then the way it kind of lives in the public, right? You look at Roosevelt's articulation, you see this image of a Thanksgiving dinner, and it plays a little bit differently. And so I want to talk about that disconnect, right, a little bit. So after Roosevelt presents the four freedoms, Fortune magazine notes that freedom from want, they called it the most ambiguous of his four freedoms. But Americans were incredibly inspired by it. But they also took it to mean something different from Roosevelt. I think that difference is represented in Rockwell's painting. Roosevelt's framing is international trade relations, economic understandings. The accepted definition in public is more securing the standard of living, right? Which many people had been seeing increasingly a more secure standard of living as the kind of home front production industry and stuff like that started to build up, and they did not want to return to the Depression. So crucial to that idea is the standard of living is employment. And let me add a little bit more paint to that by taking a brief moment to talk about Carlos Bulasan's essay that was partnered and paired with Rockwell's painting in 1943. In March 43, the Saturday Evening Post accompanied each of Rockwell's paintings with a brief essay about each of the freedoms. And in each of the essays, the writers juxtaposed the freedoms with the values with the absence of those freedoms and values among the Axis powers. But freedom from one operated a little bit differently. Bullison does that same kind of work, but he also highlights injustice against marginalized people within the United States. And he talks about their aspirations for a better life. And so one of the moments I tried to extract here from that brief essay is this one I've noted here at the bottom. Our march towards security and peace is the march of freedom, the freedom that we should like to become a living part of. All men, whatever their color, race, religion, or estate, should be given equal opportunities to serve themselves and each other according to their needs and abilities, right? And so freedom from want was one that people in the general public latched onto, and it was one that marginalized people in the United States latched onto as well. And so that freedom, the four freedoms in general, but that freedom in particular had a certain kind of resonance that people would build on. And so from there, we get to Executive Order 8802, right? That kind of built rationale within the White House and out there in public life, represented by the depictions of Rockwell and the writing of writers like Bullison, leads to Executive Order 8802, right? Those kinds of ideas. And so the rationale of the Fair Employment Order, I think, has two key parts. And so I've noted first, they needed production. And so in the order, it says the democratic way of life within the nation can be defended successfully only with the help and support of all groups within its borders. But discrimination was a barrier to that. So available and needed workers have been barred from employment in home front defense industries solely because of race, creed, color, or national origin, to the detriment of workers' morale and of national unity, right? And so that combo frames the issue as a problem of productivity, of bottom line production, and it frames as a problem of moral politics. There's a kind of practical dollars and cents appeal, and there's the moral appeal, and Roosevelt wants to partner those in the order, right? And furthermore, it's important to note this anti-discrimination order needs to be an executive order because at the time, Roosevelt could not have gotten anything like this through Congress. He could not have gotten a congressional law passed through at this time with his dependence upon Southern Democrats to advance a domestic agenda, for example, the things that he was passing in the New Deal. And they frequently were filtering so much of that agenda through Jim Crow. And that was what was known as the Southern veto. And so Southern veto would not have allowed something to pass through Congress, but as a national security necessity, that opened up the space for the executive order. And so the executive order is what is issued in June of 1941. So some of the key mechanics. Now here on the right side, I have this plaque here, and this plaque is a quote of the most famous lines. These are the lines you often see the most when people talk about Executive Order 8802. And I'll read this really quickly. I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that, and this is usually where it starts for folks, there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. That's the part that people usually know. Continuing. And I do hereby declare that it is the duty of employers and of labor organizations in furtherance of said policy and of this order to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin. So the practical key mechanics are there. Prohibits discrimination in vocational training programs. It establishes anti-discrimination provisions in civilian federal departments and in home front contracting. And then, a piece not here, but it's crucially important, is that it establishes the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC, and the FEPC will investigate claims of discrimination. And that becomes the kind of investigative body that becomes the governmental arm of 8802. And that's the quick standard story. That is, if people get to read it in a textbook, if people see it in some quick sweep of a kind of documentary story, that is often what people will get for the most part. So I want to move from there to the next stage for a number of important reasons. One, I think that there are significant limitations to that story that we have to pay some attention to. It is important to understand the presidential perspective, but not to get overly president-centric so that the president becomes the singular visionary person intervening in the process. And we don't see all of the context that surrounds presidential decision-making there, right? And that's just a tendency that we have. And I'll hop to the right-hand side. The right-hand side here is the image, a digital image of the actual poster that I have in my classroom. And I often note that if there is any staple decoration that you will find in every US history or civics or government politics classroom, it is the poster of the president or the ceiling trim of the presidents or the banner of the presidents. That's a common reference point and a valuable reference point, but it can be limiting if you just understand history as a march through the presidents, right? So often I'll find myself teaching, I'll talk about some moment in history and I'll get into some nitty gritty details or something political, and I'll notice students' eyes go to the poster as this kind of frame of reference, who was president at the time, right? So we get very centered on presidential action in a way that can lose some of the rich, meaningful texture of the stories. And I'll also note that this also will particularly happen in the case of executive orders, because executive orders kind of have that feel of a president intervening and just making it so. And so that loses some of the valuable stories of the grassroots and of everyday people. And part of the work of the Rosie the Riveter Trust and of the Rosie the Riveter Homefront Park is to amplify those stories of everyday people. So we have to do that in this conversation as well. And I want to do that now. So if you bring the grassroots context into it, you see a really fascinating civil rights story at play. And so I'd first introduce A. Philip Randolph, labor and civil rights activist who was known for combining civil rights issues and labor issues. As a young man, he was inspired by W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. He's a teenager at the time. He moves to Harlem in the mid 1910s. And he co-founds the Messenger magazine, which is a prominent periodical of the Harlem Renaissance era. And one of the famous lines about the Messenger was that the Department of Justice once referred to it as the most able and the most dangerous of all the Negro publications. So he became a prominent figure in activist and advocacy circles. And then the big event for him, a big game-changing event, is that in 1925, Randolph becomes the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the most prominent Black union and the first African-American union recognized by the American Federation of Labor. And Ranger Betty Reed Soskin, who I imagine many people on this call are familiar with, the great park ranger at the Rosie the Riveter Park, notes that that service generation was a traditional pathway into the middle class for African-Americans at the time. And so A. Philip Randolph was leading the most significant organized unit of that service generation. Actually, and I'll note as an aside, also in 1925, Randolph is among a group of African-American leaders who petitions the White House, petitions President Coolidge to enact an anti-lynching law. That is unsuccessful, but it's worth noting that he does have previous history with the White House before the moment that we're about to talk about right now. Okay, so the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that Randolph leads. It's called a brotherhood, but the BSCP does represent Black men and Black women, porters, maids, attendants, and busboys on all the commuter trains of the Pullman Company. And the Pullman Company at one point employs more Black people than any other organization in the United States. The Pullman Porters, the union, the BSCP, at one point it has up to about 18,000 members. And so they're a big part of the upward mobility and economic security for many Black Americans. This is reliable work, and it's probably work that George Pullman himself certainly didn't think could ever have been meaningfully organized and unionized. He didn't see that coming. But it's a significant path of upward mobility. Oakland, California, Oakland's Black middle class of the early 20th century is a testament to the power of the Pullman Porters, being that it was at the end of the Transcontinental Railroad line. Oakland was a logical home for a number of Pullman Porter members. So a lot of BSCP members laid down roots out here in the Bay Area in Oakland. But Randolph's ability to organize successfully the BSCP and get a number of victories is really important, and it cements him as a national force that wasn't just a guy talking, he was accomplishing concrete things. And so this last point here I have from one of Randolph's biographers, Andrew Kirsten. He says, by the time of World War II, the time that we're talking about, Randolph was a hero of the African-American working class and the nation's preeminent pioneer of nonviolent mass protest politics. The BSCP and Randolph were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. Now, as the 1930s turns to the 1940s and we layer the civil rights context on top of this presidential context, Black activists and civil rights organizations are committed to increasing the pressure on Roosevelt. They were all in agreement that Roosevelt had worked hard for Black progress, and he had done more than any administration since Reconstruction, but they wanted him to do more, and they thought that he played it way too safe with the Southern veto, so they were going to push him. And Randolph was the kind of person that had a reputation for both pushing and advancing issues, but also being able to bridge the different ideological divides within activist and advocate circles. So he became a kind of natural leader for that, in addition to, of course, his crucial position as the head of the most prominent Black union in the United States. Okay, and so what we get from this is a March on Washington movement, right? So first, what happens in September of 1940, so we're well before the executive order, Randolph invites Eleanor Roosevelt to the BSCP's annual meeting. And in the annual meeting, the union passes a resolution calling to desegregate the military. And we know that gets the attention of the White House because 10 days later, FDR is bringing in civil rights leaders, including Randolph, and in a conversation with military advisors. So they have a conversation about how they can pursue some of these interests. Black civil rights leaders leave the conversation having a positive impression, a good feeling about the conversation, but afterwards they hear a White House spokesman say that the official government policy is we're not integrating enlisted personnel. They leave a little bit of a window for something else that the activists had asked for, which was the desegregation of home front work, but they say we're not desegregating enlisted personnel. So the civil rights activists are very frustrated and they feel betrayed. Now, apparently it was commonly the case that a lot of people went into meetings with FDR feeling totally persuaded that they were on the same page and of the same accord, and then left the meeting and found out that things were different. That apparently was not an unusual feeling, but this was a frustrating feeling for the organizers. And so they determined to take a far more forceful path. And that's the path that we call this March on Washington movement, that they'll really get going in 1941. Okay, so they started getting this idea, the movement together in 41, early in January. And Randolph talks about it with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters leadership early in the year, particularly as he's traveling through the South and visiting different union hubs for the BSCP. And he's pulling the idea together, and the idea is coming together, and he starts to pitch it out to other civil rights groups. It catches fire immediately in the first month of the year. The NAACP becomes probably the most significant second supporter of the movement. And by the end of the month, the NAACP has arranged protests in 23 states that take place at the end of January in 1941, protesting offices and business sites and stuff like that to try to desegregate these places. At the same time, Randolph is also advocating for the march by writing in the Black newspapers all throughout the spring of the year. The BSCP members are still crisscrossing the country on trains, so they're carrying the message nationwide as well. And it starts to get the attention again of the White House, which is uncomfortable with the idea. So First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who is already a member of the NAACP, and of course is the main White House kind of liaison on civil rights issues, repeatedly discourages Randolph and Walter White, the head of the NAACP, from pursuing the march. Says, we're on the same page, we support your general interest, but we don't think the march is the right thing to do. Let's slow it down. A march might create more trouble than you need or you want. But the March on Washington folks are committed. They're committed to the cause and they're going to pursue it. And so what you see here on the right-hand side is a letter that the committee sent to Eleanor Roosevelt. A letter saying, look, here we go. We plan to pursue this. And so they send her a letter saying, here's the idea. You see that they propose on the right hand to my dear Mrs. Roosevelt to pass on a memo of proposals to President Roosevelt for urgent consideration. And so they send this letter, they send proposals, and they send this literature, right? And so they send, they get to see the pamphlets that are going around the country to support the march effort, right? And so this is from one of those pamphlets, right? So they sent Eleanor Roosevelt this pamphlet that details the purposes of the march and how they intend to proceed. And there's a lot to take in here, so you can kind of pass your eye over all the kind of great details on here. But I draw your attention to the language on the bottom right-hand side, a fight for real democracy, to make democracy actual, right? That is a challenge to a lot of the kind of public presentation of issues in this moment. And a Negro March for Jobs and Justice. For folks on this call who recall the full name of the 1963 March on Washington, right? That's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. You see the language here as well, right? And then on the bottom left-hand side, I would note that in addition to the kind of signature committing someone to participate in the March on Washington so as to cause the President of the United States to abolish discrimination in the defense industry and armed services. This particular person, Mrs. Anna Williams, I've noted on the bottom, she's written here, as our commander-in-chief, our race is appealing to you for the rights for a livelihood. Tired of Jim Crowism, it must end, right? And so these kinds of letters are the kinds of letters that the March on Washington movement also accumulated and tried to deliver to the White House as well. Now, it's also worth noting that this is not the first March on Washington, right? That there is an established tradition up to this point of marches on Washington, or what we might call living petitions. Living petitions was the language of this first march here on the left, 1894's Coxey's Army March, the unemployment march of 1894, comparatively early in a depression at that time. Very kind of populist in sentiment. Some of its requests for government support and intervention in the economy are some of the things that the New Deal will actually pick up a couple of generations later. But you can see comparative to scale, 500 marchers who don't really get tremendously far into Washington, D.C. Feels like a limited scale, but that would have been one of the first marches that Randolph certainly would have been familiar with. Then there's the Great Suffrage March of 1913, which is trying to build on the momentum that's been established at state and local levels for women's suffrage, and build that out to a national scale. Of course, by the end of this decade, we'll get the 19th Amendment and we'll get women's suffrage. And then in 1932, there's the Bonus Army March, once again, early in a bigger depression, the Great Depression, a larger depression than the depression that Coxey's Army is responding to. But the Bonus Army March is a march of veterans requesting early reception of bonuses that they were promised, right? And that march has 15,000 marchers, give or take. And I want to draw attention to that march in particular because, as depicted in this image here on the right, that one got ugly at times. And so a number of these veteran protest marchers had ugly clashes with law enforcement, and it did result in a couple of those veteran protesters dying. And so that one in particular is worth drawing some attention to, and also looking at the increasing scale of these marches: 500 marchers, 10,000 marchers, 15,000 marchers. Well, the March on Washington movement of 1941 intended to bring 100,000 marchers, right? And so after sending that literature to the White House, Franklin Roosevelt brings in Randolph and Walter White 2 weeks before the proposed march of July 1st, and he asks them, how many people will you bring to Washington? They say 100,000. And that's Randolph. And then FDR turns to Walter White, who's considered the kind of more moderate of the two. And he says, Walter, how many will really march? And Walter White says 100,000, right? Could they have achieved that scale? Who knows? But if it was anything close to that scale, Roosevelt was pretty concerned, because Roosevelt is afraid of what might happen if scores of thousands of Black people come to protest in Washington, D.C., which is at this time a city with a white Southern police force. So that those images that we identify with the civil rights movement 20 years after this might have been scenes that could have happened in 1941. This is not the publicity that Roosevelt wants in the midst of a kind of fight for global freedom. And so he's incredibly concerned about that. And it is apparent in what he says in other meetings after this in the White House, right? That he's concerned about the kind of possibilities of what this may mean, what this march may mean. So he's really insisting on asking for Randolph and White to call off the march. And so negotiation happens, there's give and take, and 1 week before the proposed march is when we get Executive Order 8802. So that civil rights context is crucially important, right? And furthermore, here are the proposals mentioned before, the memo proposals that were sent to them. And you see the first 3 proposal points here make it into the final order in modified form, but the first 3 points that they ask for here, right? The forbidding of contract discrimination, right? The abolition of discrimination, segregation in federal government offices, and vocational and defense training course anti-discrimination measures. All 3 of those make it in. The other 3 do not, and most notably the sore spot is at point 4. The desegregation of the armed services does not happen at this point in time. That comes later in 1948, and Randolph will play a role in that when that does happen, but it doesn't happen at this time, and that is still a sore point at this particular moment. But the first 3 proposal points are in the final memo. So ultimately, the March on Washington Committee might as well be co-writers of that executive order, right? And so that's the kind of combo of the presidential story, give you some of that civil rights context, and then I want to talk a little bit about what some of the important takeaways I think are to bear in mind. First, you see the seeds of the civil rights movement in 8802, right? As you see here, the March on Washington movement insisted that we fight for global democracy abroad, we have to secure a more inclusive democracy at home, right? That posture, that attitude established in the March on Washington movement, that becomes key to a lot of civil rights action throughout World War II, right? And in 1942, the following year, the Pittsburgh Courier, famous African-American newspaper, labels that the Double V campaign. And so here's a little bit of the, and so the Pittsburgh Courier kind of floats the slogan early in 1942, and it catches on, and then they actually articulate and define it on February 14th, 1942, where they say, this slogan, the Double V campaign, represents the true battle cry of colored America. Americans all are involved in a gigantic war effort to assure the victory for the cause of freedom, the 4 freedoms. Therefore, we have adopted the Double V war cry. In our fight for freedom, we wage a 2-pronged attack against our enslavers at home and those abroad who would enslave us. We have a stake in this fight. We are Americans too, right? So you see them echoing back some of that language of the 4 freedoms, that language of Roosevelt, and owning it, right? And then giving a different purpose to it. And then furthermore, to think about 8802 as a kind of key seed of the civil rights movement, I like to think about how you often hear the civil rights movement discussed as the second Reconstruction, right? And if we think about the civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction, then we need to think about how 8802 reestablishes a connection between the government and civil rights issues. The Fair Employment Practices Committee is the first federal action since Reconstruction, right, that really engages the federal government in that kind of work. And on the other hand, sometimes you hear people refer to the civil rights movement as not just the second, but the People's Reconstruction, that's on the right here. And the March on Washington movement, in that case, shows the power of citizen action. The March on Washington movement is crucial. It models the kind of outsider politics that we pay so much attention to in the 50s and 60s. And then some cautions. Let's not flatten the story too much. Beware of the 2-dimensional story, to beware of the flattened story. Anti-discrimination did not equal integration. When Black workers joined the home front workforce, they faced residential segregation, they faced segregation at their jobs, ways that are segregated as any other aspects of American life at the time. Labor unions would not meaningfully integrate for another decade. So anti-discrimination measures means they get jobs, but that doesn't mean those jobs were equal, right? Separate but equal Jim Crowism is still the law of the land. And so we see segregation there, and different organizations find ways to kind of work around the order in that way. Famous stories that Ranger Betty tells and Lincoln Cushing has told earlier in this speaker series. The Boilermakers unions, for example, really important to shipyards, created auxiliary units where Black workers would technically be part of the union, would be part of the union, but we dues paying part of the union, but will work separately from the white Boilermakers, for example. That's a famous example. And Ranger Betty Reed Soskin tells a story of working as a clerk in the Boilermakers Auxiliary Annex in downtown Richmond, never seeing a ship launched, never seeing a ship built, right? And then also on the other side, beware of the linear stories of progress, because we know that Executive Order 8802 comes out in June of 41, but we just had the Day of Remembrance just last weekend for Executive Order 9066, just last Saturday, 80 years, right? So 8 months after 8802, we see 9066 authorizing the forced relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans. So that is a reminder that this progress is not always linear. It halts, it turns, it shifts, it backslides, and it faces backlash. So it's not just an endless linear kind of forward progression. And then I think an important thing that 8802 shows us is do not ignore outsider politics. This graphic that I share here is actually from the textbook that I use, and I do enjoy a lot, but I just criticize this one table, right? This table that you see here tells a kind of story of civil rights that's very insider-centric. The name of the table is Cause and Effect of the Civil Rights Movement, right? We read from left to right. So we read from the judicial and legal action, and then we see the political grassroots action. And I would suggest that that's an inversion very often of the way things go and the way things happen, right? That it suggests that government does the big intervention first and then creates the permission structure, as opposed to what we see in a story like 8802 and so many other civil rights stories where the outsider politics, a citizen action creates the conditions and also creates the demands that government has to respond to. So we shouldn't lose sight of those when we take a look at these stories either. Executive Order 8802 is a political action. It happens in a context, and that context matters. The March on Washington forces the issue of 8802, and 8802 is an anti-discrimination measure. It's not an affirmative creation of jobs. So job seekers have to make it mean something. They have to go out there and seek jobs. Employers have to give them jobs, and then they have to present complaints when discrimination happens so that the FEPC can expose those injustices. So people, before and after the actual act of the executive order, make it mean something, and that matters. And let me close out. Last year when I talked about the 80th anniversary, this is how I signed off, and I'll sign off here this way as well. The ultimate impact of 8802 may be considered modest in comparative scale to its advocates' goals, the larger social movement to come, and the work to be done. But 8802 re-engaged the federal government in matters of race and equality, a crucial commitment to America's promise, and its larger social context is a testament to the power of citizen action. In both of these regards, it remains an important and underappreciated event, signposting a path for positive change. Thank you everybody. Thank you, Rosie Riveter Trust. These are some of this is a kind of roll call, some of the inspiration and what I just shared. And thank you for everybody who took the time to lend me your eyes and your ears and your thoughts. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. That was really great, and a lot of important things to think about. We do have a number of questions, so just wanted to begin with one back to the issue of the marches. The question was, how likely do you think that the executive order would have been if that march of 100,000 had not been planned, and that with FDR knowing about it?
Yeah, it absolutely would not have happened. There would have been no executive order. There absolutely would not have been an executive order.
That certainly makes sense. And then also, I think, in addition to seeing that side by side, all the information, the reminders about the civil rights work that had been going on, important to remember how long FDR had already been in office, and that, this was not sudden for him, that this has been what, 7 or 8 years already that he'd been dealing with these issues. So it was certainly expedient for the time. Speaking of which, we had an obligation to fill lend-lease orders. So what do you think, how strong that connection is of of needing all of our potential workers, potential people in the workforce to make those Lend-Lease deliveries to England.
I mean, I'll speak generally about the idea that the executive order itself speaks to the idea of needing to muster available and necessary production power. So the executive order itself already speaks to the need to tremendously ramp up production and the need for virtually to have all hands on deck in responding to that concern. That operates on all kinds of fronts. And so I think, I hope that speaks to the kind of primary issue of the question, right? Which is that there's a bottom line productivity issue that they're trying to respond to, in addition to the kind of moral geopolitics issue.
Yes. And if anyone else has questions, we do have time. So if you could write a note in the chat, you can connect to that at the bottom of your screen. Malik, what do we know about wages during this time? So we had a prohibition against discrimination or segregation, but was there any parity in wages between whites and blacks?
Okay, yeah, so a couple things. Racial wage disparities definitely existed because there was no law. People could bring complaints to the FEPC with varying degrees of success. The FEPC did not have a particularly robust enforcement arm. Most of its power was in exposure of the problems. So there wasn't that. So there wasn't, for example, the equal pay for equal work that you had on gender lines, for example, which were different protections. Now, at the same time, companies could also get around that by the kind of jobs they would offer people, right? If you had a job that was naturally paid less than another job was, then they could just pay you less, right?
Mm-hmm.
That certainly happened to women in a lot of cases, to once again, to kind of circumvent laws. But there were no racial laws, so those could get a little messier. But either way, there were a lot of workarounds that a lot of these companies had, because I think it's important to appreciate that a lot of these jobs, and particularly we see this in the story of the Bay Area, where we have these, we have the shipyards. The shipyards were also these social environments too. They're like blue collar men, white men's social environments too. And that made a significant difference in how they in their discomfort in integrating those spaces as well. And so labor changes portended social changes that they were trying to hold off as long as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And also I appreciate you mentioning the executive order 9066 about the Japanese internments, which, you know, is such a big deal here on the West Coast, in the East Bay, Richmond, particularly. So before we get too proud of ourselves for 8802, that we have to realize what happened so soon afterwards, without much of an effort to distinguish. I think what was about 2/3 of the Japanese were actually American citizens. So it's tough sometimes looking at history.
And we have to own all of it, right? We have to own all of it. That is crucially important. And yeah, so I certainly don't want to give a story that, 8802 does not just flip a switch and then everything is great and everything is great moving forward. By no means, right? Is that the case?
Thank you. Malik, I'm going to share your article again in the chat for people that would like to read the magazine article that he published for the 80th anniversary last year. And we thank you for all your insights. Did you want to do a little closing?
No, I am good. I'm just appreciative that people kind of took the time to come out and listen, and have the, and I'm thankful for the opportunity really to, again, I would honestly say that, and this is not just because I'm here talking to the Rosie the Riveter Trust. the Rosie the Riveter National Homefront Park is a treasure of the Bay Area. You know, it, for folks who are here who are in the Bay Area, if you've never been there, please visit it in Richmond at the site of the old Kaiser shipyards. If you're not in the Bay Area, visit it virtually online, National Park Service. But it is done, as much as anything else for me to deepen my understanding and appreciation of the homefront experience, right? And to as Rosie the Riveter Park says, to amplify the stories of everyday people, right? And so hopefully this chat does a little bit of that as well by telling that grassroots story and partnering it with that presidential story. That's I think how I would sign off.
Thank you so much. And thanks for doing our outreach and communications for us and advertising the park. Before we go, may I introduce the executive director of Rosie the Riveter Trust, Sarah Pritchard, who'd also like to say a few words.
Yeah, hi, everybody. It is wonderful to see you all. And Malik, I'm just so impressed. And, it's a wonderful way to end my day, to learn something new and important, and to be reminded to not just take something at sort of surface level, but to be inquisitive. And I think that's really sums up what we're doing here tonight, and also with Rosie Presents. This is really, we're launching this. This is quite a new kind of program project for us at Rosie the Riveter Trust. I want to thank my colleague, Michelle Fedeli, for really bringing this to fruition. We are, if you have an idea for a presenter, please let us know. Please contact us at rosietheriveter.org. You can look at, or just go for info@rosietheriveter.org. We're pretty easy to find, but we're excited and we love coming together in community. We would do this, we do it sometimes in person, and as we open up more, we'd like to do more of it, but I certainly think that this is a great forum in order to share. I think about it like the salon that people have done, where, let's get together, let's present, let's talk, and let's engage, because I think it's really fascinating, and I think it's really important. As I end, and I also do want to remind you that this will be up on our YouTube channel, and you will be able to see the recording. One of my, Lisa, who's really behind the scenes and has been helping with this, Lisa, and also Joe. But this is a quote that Lisa put up on our social media, our Facebook and Instagram the other day, from Betty Reed Soskin. And the trust is all about, we are the official partner of this national park. And I love what you have said, Malik, about it, because it's truly an honor. It's truly a gem of an urban park. And about all parks, what Betty says is, it is now possible for us, through this incredible system of national parks, to revisit any era in history, the heroic places, the contemplative places, the scenic wonders, the shameful places, and the painful places. We can revisit them in order to own that history, that we may process that history in order to forgive ourselves, so that we may move into a more compassionate future together. And I bid you all a wonderful evening. I thank you for joining us and just coming together in community.
Thank you. Thanks again, Malik.
Thank you, Malik. Thanks, everyone.